Okay. Welcome, everyone. If you are new to our study group, thank you for joining us. We have these 2 times per month, except in December when we have it 1 time per month because we kind of take a break for some self-care over the holidays. I love these study groups. I think they're great for real-time interaction. You can ask questions. This community is great. You can really bounce ideas off of one another and support one another. So I keep coming to them if you have not come before, or if I see a lot of familiar faces. Thank you for signing on today. So like I said, we're going to talk about board of directors and executive directors. So that's more of that policy procedures macro work. I will show a very quick overview of the platform. I left that to the end last time and I did not get to it. So I'm definitely going to do it first. And then we will jump into content from there. Someone said, I'm looking here in the chat. We have a very mixed bag of our macro skills here. And hopefully some of the terms that we're going through today or some of the content will help you understand more of like what governs a nonprofit, what governs an agency. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Oops, our Google. Can you all see this? Thumbs up if you can see this. Okay. This is your dashboard. If you have just started with Agents of Change, this is what you're going to see. It's now, we're working on building out a few different products. We now have a clinical power pack, and hopefully by next month or December, we'll have a master's power pack. So that's going to go a little bit deeper into the different things, but that's just supplemental to your study. So your dashboard's going to be on the left, and it's broken down by topics. So people always ask, well, how do I go through the program? Go in order. It's designed for you to go in order. It follows the different units and they build upon each other, right? So you're going to get some of this. Some people are like, what is this stuff at the beginning? This is all just setting the stage. That's the purpose, right? You got to lay the foundation before you jump in to some of the actual content. But I go over strategy, right? So I have the 5 W's, I have breaking down questions. And then after you've done probably a couple hours of kind of setting the stage, then it jumps into the content. But people always ask me, where can you find the study groups? There is a section called live study group sessions. So if you click that, you just click here and it is now a Google Doc. So check this, it will be live. You just click the Zoom meeting link and it will take you. I will have November study group dates posted probably in the next week or so. You'll have November study group dates because I know we need to get those on the calendar. Jumping back to here. If you miss a study group and I always record it and I always post it. So you'd go to past study groups, you'd open this, and you can see all of our study groups from the year. When we get to 2023, we'll be retiring the 2021 study groups. But you will have all of the 2022 study groups. And that's just because I don't want to put too much stuff out there where it's overwhelming people. So we will have just the study groups from 1 year prior. If you're ever looking, some people are like, I am looking for abuse and neglect. You can just type in abuse and you will see here all of the different, you can easily use that search bar to find what you're looking for. So we have safety and abuse, we have child abuse and neglect, elder abuse, substance abuse and addiction. Utilize this search if you are like, you have a topic you're struggling with that you want to dive a little bit deeper. Any questions about the platform or how to use it? If you have not yet, poke around in there. Any technical questions you have, email us. You definitely want to use a browser that's up to date. Google Chrome is the best. So if you have and people sometimes say they can't see it. If you're working on a work computer and they have firewalls, like at my work, like certain things don't open, you might run into issues there. So that would be like a network thing that you're blocked from accessing that site. So I do encourage you to make sure that you're on a browser that is compatible. Message me if you have any questions about that. Okay. So now we're going to jump into today's study group, which is board of directors, and nonprofits. Have any of you, you could go ahead and in the chat, sat on a board of a nonprofit or interact maybe in your roles at your agencies or at your settings with the board of nonprofits? I have not ever sat on a board, but I have met with board members of schools and different agencies. I'm just curious if anyone had that experience. Okay, great. So this will be good because we will all be learning together. And maybe what usually happens is you might really have a passion for something. So you might be asked to sit on the board of a nonprofit in an area that is something that you're interested in. So board of directors and nonprofits. Nonprofits have to have a board of directors, and that's kind of who, I also wanted, people always ask, you will get access to this information. So you do not have to take down you don't have to copy word for word, interact in a way that's going to make sense for you. If you want to take notes, if you want to go back and take notes, up to you, but you will get this information. I always want to preface it with that. So what does a nonprofit board do? They kind of oversee everything that's going on with that organization or that agency. They meet periodically. The best practice is to meet at least once a year, but most will meet once a quarter. So maybe 3 times a year, 4 times a year. But the minimum is once a year. Why do you think that the minimum would be once a year for a nonprofit board to meet? Go ahead in the chat. Why do you think a minimum of once per year? You definitely are going to need to meet at least once a year to talk about finances, right? There's a fiscal year that you will follow. So that's definitely part of it. Laws change, policies change. If you don't meet at least once a year, your policies could be outdated. You could get into a lot of messy situations, right? Because like, what if you didn't all meet for 2 years and stuff had really gone astray? So you definitely operate on a fiscal year. You need to make sure that the responsibilities are being met. And if there's not oversight, that's when things can go south, right? Like if you don't have a board that is doing what they need to do to oversee, it can be problematic. So like I said, it's usually once a quarter. It depends on how big the agency is. It depends on the needs, right? Sometimes there's emergency board meetings. So an emergency board meeting would be, maybe there's some sort of legal thing coming up that needs to be discussed right away, and the board members would have to come together, or sometimes things need to be voted on right away. So say a policy was passed or a law was passed, and that's going to completely change the course of the work that you do at the agency. If that were the case, you would need to have the board members come together to maybe do an emergency vote or something like that. Very important that you're meeting often enough to meet the needs of the agency. So what are some of the basic responsibility of the board? This is the board members. And people always ask me who would be on a board. It depends on the agency. And people always ask me, is it volunteer or is it paid? Depends. It really all depends on what's going on. There are a lot of nonprofit boards in different sectors, not necessarily social services, where they are expected to give donations to the agency to sit on the board, or they're expected to bring in X amount of money in fundraising to sit on the board. Some do get money to sit on the board, but a lot are volunteer, right? A lot are volunteer positions to sit on the board. It depends though. So you can get paid. There might be expectations. It really depends. Something I encourage you to do, I was doing that this morning. I typed in board of directors, social work. Every state NASW has a board of directors. The licensing board has board of directors. A lot of different people interact with social work, like the Clinical Social Worker Association has a board. So go ahead, just poke around, check in. I just Googled and it was interesting, some of the requirements that were listed for board members. So what does the nonprofit board do? Determine the mission and purpose. An agency cannot function without a mission. So you might be coming up with a mission statement. You might be reviewing the mission statement. You might be going through a lot of different iterations of this, right? Maybe you're like, we're going to start with this vision, but then when you meet maybe quarterly, you're like, this isn't really in line with where we're moving, right? Nonprofits can change, their mission can change, their purpose can change. So important that there is a mission. If you work for a nonprofit or an agency and you don't know the mission statement, go ahead and check that out. And it's really important to discuss this. This is something that I don't think it's talked about enough. Every agency should have a mission statement, and it should match what your work that you're doing. I was at a school, we had a mission statement. It did not align with anything we were doing at all. We had to go back to scratch, meet with parents, meet with stakeholders, and come up with a new one. So it was out of date. It was not one that made sense. What else does the board do? They might select the executive director or the CEO of that nonprofit. So generally the board is the CEO or the executive director's boss. So we'll talk about what the executive director does in a moment here, but usually the board is in charge of doing the job search for the executive director or the CEO. They usually come up with a job description. They will do a lot of the interviewing. They'll come up with the requirements of what they're looking for. We will get to that. Someone says, is the board involved with day-to-day operations? That's gonna be on our what the board should not do. So hold that question for in the next 7 to 10 minutes, because I will get to that. But very good question. What do they do on a day-to-day basis? So they're selecting, they're coming up with the job description, and they're usually heading the hiring committee for this. And usually they'll bring in maybe multiple candidates. They should have a standardized process that the candidates are going for. They should have their set of interview questions, and they might do a panel interview. It could be a variety of different things, but they are in charge of that search. They support, and like we talked about this, they're in charge of the executive directors. So they generally do evaluate their performance, right? Here's a really important one. They should make sure that the CEO has the moral and professional support. This is where it gets tricky, right? How many times have you seen in the news that a CEO has not been engaging or like in a professional or ethical or legal action? They would need to be removed by the board. So if something is kind of shady going on in an organization, it's by a CEO or the executive director. It can be called different titles, the person that's in charge of the organization. The board needs to remedy that. That's up to the board. So there are some questions we'll go over of like, how does that information get to the board? You'd have to go up the chain of commands, but the board needs to be aware if there is illegal or unethical things going on in an organization. They can't make any changes. They have to be aware. And because they're not in the day-to-day stuff, it's important that that information gets to them. They plan. Planning is going to be really important. They're going to, do probably strategic planning. Like I said, if you're meeting once a year, it might be for the next year. If you're meeting quarterly, it might be for the next quarter, but they need to monitor this. So similarly to how we as social workers, we constantly are evaluating, taking data in, the board would have to do that too. The strategic plan, you want to make sure that you're meeting your goals, right? So say there's a strategic plan and the agency is not meeting any of the goals in the plan. What do you think? Why do you think that information would be important? So maybe the strategic plan is we are going to reduce homelessness by 10% in the next year, and they are not meeting that at all. What do you think the board would have to consider when planning or revising the strategic plan? The agency is not meeting its goals. What might the board do to plan for that? Reevaluate, right? They need to collect information. What are the barriers? What are the barriers? Are there implementation barriers? Is there training things that need to happen? They need to collect more information, or maybe was that goal not realistic, right? Maybe that was just way too lofty of a goal. And remember, in nonprofits, things change Maybe there was not the funding they need. Maybe you lost a grant that was needed to happen. But you need to collect more information always, because you don't want to have goals that are not meeting the agency's needs. So you need to plan effectively. Monitor and strengthen programs and services. This is kind of going on to that point that we just talked about. They need to determine which programs are consistent with the mission and monitor their effectiveness. Budget is a huge thing. I feel like with nonprofits, they are always competing for funds. Funds are limited. So the agency might be having to cut, let's say they have to cut finances and they have to cut spending by 10%. They might have to say, you know, this program is not really servicing our needs, or it's not going to fit into our budget, and they might have to eliminate that program. Or maybe they got some more funding and they're like, what is the highest priority that we need to bring to the agency? So they make budget cuts. Unfortunately, cuts usually happen more than getting funding, but they will, you know, be able to determine together. And usually it goes to a vote. It's not so that just one person is guiding the ship. It will go to a vote so that the group, along with the executive director, the board and the executive director, are able to make those decisions. Ensuring adequate financial resources. We talked about this a lot. That is a big part of board members. They often are participating in funding opportunities because nonprofits cannot run without funds. So in the chat, go ahead, write us, how are some ways that you think nonprofits or your agencies get funds? What are some different ways that your places of employment get funds to run the agency? Fees, right? You might charge fees for services. Grants are huge. A lot of agencies depend on grants. Insurance billing, that is bringing in money, right? If you're working in a clinical setting, that's how money comes in. State budgets, right? Some state agencies will receive money directly from that state. Donations. Some nonprofits, I work in a school, parents donate to the parent-teacher organization. That gives us some funding to do certain things. You might get government support, right? You might get federal funds for certain things, like you might be getting Medicaid funds. So there are a variety of different revenue. You might have donors that are making donations for different programs, right? So there are a variety of different ways, but it's important for the test to know that there's a variety of different revenue streams that could help a nonprofit run. Board members might do fundraising, they might plan events. You see all the time nonprofits having fundraising events, right? They might host galas, they might do silent auctions, a variety of different things where part of the money will go to making sure that there is enough budgeting to have the nonprofit continue to run. What else do? They protect assets and provide financial oversight. Generally, most nonprofits will have a legal counsel. They'll have an accountant so that the experts in those areas are able to make the decisions that need to happen. So if legal stuff comes up, what do we know as social workers if legal stuff comes up? Do we give legal advice? Do we give financial advice? No, right? We would not be making those decisions as clinicians, as people, as part of the organizations. But if you sit on a board, you may, right? But that would be separate than your job in the agency. So the board members should be knowledgeable about the budget and what this means for day-to-day operations. So like I said, we'll get to this in a second, what board members should not do. They should know what happens day to day with the stakeholders in the agency. Why do you think it's important for board members to have a pulse of what happens day to day? Why should board members know what's happening daily? And it does not mean, oh, on Mondays this happens. Like, I mean that they have a pulse of what's going on the ground. Why do you think that's important? They need to know what's going on, because if you have disengaged board members that and this unfortunately happens a lot. I see it all the time in education. People making decisions have no idea what's going on. And that is very frustrating to the people on the ground that are dealing with it day to day. So they should be understanding of what happens. They don't need to be experts, but they need to have a pulse of what's going on, because they're the ones making budget decisions. They're the ones making programming decisions. So they need to have a pulse, because you don't want them to be making decisions that affect people day to day that are not best for the people on the ground. Very, very tricky, right? Almost any agency you work for, the people making the decisions generally don't have as much information or knowledge as the people that are working in the trenches. But that's just kind of across the board problem that happens. There should be competency levels for the board, right? It usually, if someone's going to join a board, there's prerequisites that might be time commitments, that might be if you're an expert in a certain field. They also might be asked to find other people to fill spots on the board. So maybe, like, it's a lot of networking when you're up at this level. So maybe they know someone that they've sat on a board with before, those type of things. But it's important that new members are onboarded. They know the expectations. It's very clear what it would take to sit on a board. That makes sense. We talked about the legal and ethical integrity. They should, similarly to how we have a code of ethics, they should not be making any decisions that are illegal or unethical. You see in the news all the time. This, of course, does not always happen. Here in DC, there was a nonprofit agency. The executive director was embezzling all the money and was living abroad off of the agency's money, right? Clearly a breakdown, something was a breakdown there, where that was able to happen for years at a time. So, I mean, it does happen. Executive directors will go to the board, like I said, if there's legal action, maybe a client's bringing a legal suit, or maybe there's some financial problems, the executive director should be going to the board, and then the proper people, whether it's the legal team or an accountant, would be brought in as well. The board of directors also should know what's going on in the organization. We talked about a mission statement, and they should be able to know what's going on with the strategic plan. And that's why it's best to meet more than once a year, just to kind of understand what's going on. They can know what public support is needed, and they can advocate, right? So sometimes board members might advocate on behalf of the agency, but they need to know what's going on to be able to advocate. If they don't, they're not going to be advocating properly or for the right things. So someone asked, what should the board members do? What do they not do? Here is what board of directors should not do ever. No, 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 do not pass go, do not collect $200. They should not be supervising any staff members. They are removed from the day-to-day operations. They should know what's going on, but they should not be supervising any staff directly. The executive director, who we know is different than board members, is the supervisor of staff. Board members, this is important to note here, board members should only be responsible for the performance of the executive director. Why do you think they should not be in charge of micromanaging or managing or supervising staff? Why do you think that is a no-no? Go ahead in the chat. Why should board members not interact, supervise, or manage staff members other than the executive director? Conflict of interest, absolutely, right? It would get very messy. And a lot of them are not going to even be qualified to provide that direct support, right? They might not have the background. They don't have the day-to-day information, right? They're not on the ground. They're not in the trenches. Very good. Board members should not serve with members that may be a conflict of interest, right? Like it says, example, spouses being on the board together. There are some spouses that are on the board together. If there are like family members or other people on boards together, you just need to make sure that it's not a conflict of interest. And that's just kind of weighing the pros and cons, making like you don't ever want to have someone sitting on a board that is not appropriate to sit on a board, or it's like like, oh, this is a favor I'm doing for someone. No, they should really have the best interest of the agency in mind. This one is hard to find. They should be serving, they should never be serving their own best interest rather than those of the agency. Similar to politicians, right? We know that that's not always the case. That would be in the best case scenario. They always have the agency values as the most important interest, but it can be tricky, right? We don't know what sometimes goes on or why, different types of side deals and side things being made, but that would, if that is the case, that should not be someone sitting on the board. They should not make unofficial decisions that are not agreed upon or voted on by all members. Even if it's not a 100% consensus, everyone needs to be informed and given the option to have their voice heard on a matter. So there should not be one board member that makes all the decisions because they're the most powerful or they have the loudest voice. It should be definitely a democratic process with all voices equally heard. And we shouldn't have people that aren't able to put in the commitment. So some people have to step down, right? Maybe they have personal stuff going on in their life, or maybe the time commitment is supposed to be 10 hours a quarter and they're just not able to give that commitment. So it's really important that board members self-reflect similarly to we do and make sure that it's still something that is going to be manageable and productive for them to sit on the board. Before we move on, so that's the board. Does anyone have questions about the board of directors? Because we're going to move into executive directors, which are different than someone sitting on the board of directors. Okay. Now we're going to talk about executive directors, and I have a question for you all. What is the head of your agency? If you're in an agency, right? If you work for yourself at a private practice, that's a little bit different. What is the title name of the person that's in charge of your agency? Is it executive director? Is it CEO? Is it program director? Like the top person of your agency, what is their title? CEO, I'm seeing a lot. Executive director. I'm in a school, so that would be principal. Higher than that would be the chancellor of the school district. So I'm seeing a lot of CEO or executive director. For this, for purposes of what we're about to jump into, it's going to be, oh, deputy director, I've heard that as well. That's a common one. If you're in different spaces, like I'm sure at a hospital, it might be called something different than it is at a school. But for this, we're going to talk about nonprofit executive director. So in some of the content I'm about to go through, it might say ED, that means executive director, or CEO. We're going to use it synonymously. It does not mean one is right or wrong. It all depends on the agency. Even here, we see that there's different titles. So what does, before we even jump on, your CEO or your executive director, what are some duties that they do? The person that's the head of your agency, if you work in an agency, or the head of your workplace, what are some of their responsibilities? Overseeing the agency, yes. So I have here, for those that work in schools, the principal's needs, schools needs, overseeing staff, administration, budgeting, direct supervision. Let's see what else. Senior management. Community engagement, speak on, we're going to get to like some of that PR stuff. That's important too. Anything else you want to add? There's a lot of different things that they can do, but they're doing a lot of those higher level decision makings, functioning of the agency, those type of things. Okay. This is not an exclusive list. This is not exhaustive, and it might be different for different agencies, right? Every agency has different needs. So here are some things that the executive director of a nonprofit might do. Leadership. Obviously, they are the leader, right? That's just like, no matter what the case is, they are going to be the leader of the nonprofit. They usually are oversee the head of each department, right? They're kind of the go-to person. This might be, you might have a fundraising department or an HR department. They usually oversee all of that. They might oversee marketing, all those types of things. They are the leader. They are the face of the agency. Board development. The executive director should be one of the only people, or the CEO, that is working very closely with the board, right? Like clinicians on the ground are not going to be working exclusively with the board, but an executive director should be. So and that's because a lot of times you can't move forward with any decisions until you have board approval. So there's sometimes red tape, right? It might be the executive director wants to make a change, but it's got to go to a board vote first before any big things. And that's just kind of levels of protection. But they do work exclusively with the board. What else might they do? They are going to be the one that's keeping the board members informed, right? Because it's not usually going to be us clinicians on the ground. They're that liaison to make sure the board members are getting the information that they can. So communication is going to be a very important skill for CEOs and executive directors. They're always in constant communication, and there might generally be on the board, like maybe someone is like the president of the board, or there could be different structures within that. So they might not be talking to every board member all the time. There might be certain committees or certain people that they're working with. So we have that leadership piece, and they're working with the board. PR. They might be talking to, maybe there's news articles coming out. Or maybe there is a marketing campaign and they're going to be interviewed. So they're really that public face of the organization. How many times have you seen on the news or something? You see the bottom, it says executive director of so-and-so, and they're going to maybe talk about maybe the services that are going on, or if a policy, this is very common. Maybe a policy or a bill was passed and it either positively affects the agency or negatively affects it, and they go, out there to kind of give their stance or the statement for the organization. They oftentimes might give like press releases or public opinion statements about what's going on. So they might say, it is our stance that blah, blah, blah has happened, right? I'm thinking when those ASWB results came out, a lot of executive directors and a lot of nonprofit people, those CEOs were coming out and they were making statements. This is the stance that we are taking. So they are going to be the person that's visible for the stakeholders, right? They are going to be maybe writing some of those opinion things, that type of thing. It's very tricky. What are some things that an executive director or a CEO should be thinking about if they are the face of the agency and they might be talking to media, or they're going to be maybe talking to politicians or policymakers? What are some things for public relations purposes that you think should be in the mind of an executive director or a CEO? Image is huge, right? It's not going to look great if they come on and they're super unprofessional. Press, you have to know what the protocols are. You probably are going to have someone triple, quadruple checking your work before you put a statement out, right? That's not going to be a good look. You also have to be well informed. You wouldn't want to be super reactive if you are the face of an agency, right? You don't want to say, I'm so upset about this thing. You put a statement out and you don't have all the details yet. So you really got to make sure that you're researching, you have all of your information, and you definitely need to make sure that you're in a professional manner. And something, when I was like collecting all this information, they're kind of on the hot seat at all times. So how they engage outside of work, right, is very important too, because you are the face of that agency. So if something in your private life leaks into like the news or something, that could be very potentially bad. We see all the time, right? Like some stuff gets out and people get fired or are asked to step down. So you need to make sure that you're conducting yourself in a professional manner behind closed doors as well. And someone said check for accuracy. Absolutely. You need a fact check before you make any statement. So it's actually a huge amount of responsibility for these executive directors and these CEOs at that level. Talked about that financial management. I'll ask you all in a question just out of curiosity, but executive director CEOs should understand financials. There'll be accountants, there'll be people that can help, but they're going to be overseeing budgets, cash flow, income statements, balance statements, money coming in, money going out. They should understand 990 tax returns, audits, and compliance. I'm just going to ask you all, has anyone here taken a course in their social work program that talked at all about budgets, financials, any of these stuff? The stuff that I'm saying. I'm just mostly curious because I had none of this. This was not even offered. So I think that things are changing though, which is good. So I'm just curious. So some people said yes, which is great. I'm happy to see that programs are now offering this because these are skills that social workers might need, right? We might find ourselves in leadership positions. I did not receive any classes. I guess I did take a class on grants, but budgeting, audits, compliance, did not have any of that. So I would really like to see social work programs offering this, right, to people that want to take maybe more of this macro track, which I think that macro is definitely picking up because we know that policy and that higher level work's really important. So we will see, but I'm happy to see some of you did have classes in this because this was non-existent from my social work education. And I think it's really important, right? Because we don't want to have people get into these positions and they don't have the skills they need to be able to be in these higher level positions. Liaison between stakeholders. So not only are they liaisoning with the board, they should be liaisoning with people within the agency. So that might be clinicians, that might be support staff. That should also be clients, right? They should have a pulse on what's happening with clients. So I feel like executive directors have a very tricky job. They have to report up to the board of directors, and then they also have to make sure that what's going on with their employees is ethical, legal, responsible, and that employees are happy, right? It's not a good look if you're an executive director and you have super high turnover because people are not happy. So as the executive director, what would you do? What do you think are some possible things you could do if you see a report and 60% of staff feel that they're burnt out and are considered leaving the agency? You're the executive director. This comes to your desk. A lot of people might quit and morale is really low and burnout is very high. What are some things you need to consider? You definitely need to address staff concerns. You need to hear from the people, what's going on here, right? Are there policies in place that are problematic? Are there procedures in place that are problematic? Whole staff meetings, right? Maybe meeting with different people within the agency. Someone said a SWOT analysis. That is huge, right? Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. You might be doing a needs assessment for your agency. You need to have a pulse though, and you need to make sure that you are representing and respecting what's happening with your employees. Assessment is necessary. Needs assessment, needs assessment, needs assessment. Technology. So this is actually something that I am seeing much more, especially since the pandemic. The executive director needs to understand what the technology policies are, right? It needs to be ethical, it needs to be legal, especially if there's client information. So you might even have a technology expert that your agency is working with to ensure that, data is protected, you're compliant, you're HIPAA compliant, a variety of different things. But ethical technology use should be taken into consideration. the code of ethics actually now includes a portion that has technology standards that would need to be taken into consideration as well. So making sure that you're not only utilizing technology, you're utilizing it in a safe and protected manner. Organizational development, they are definitely going to be doing program development, program evaluation. Similarly to like those discussions that go on with the board, they need to make sure that what's going on in the agency, the services are quality and effective. If you have an executive director who's not ensuring programs are quality or effective, that's not going to help the agency, right? Like they need to make sure that what's happening is helpful. They also need to set expectations for personnel, right? So they might be setting workplace policies, procedures. They might be working very closely with HR if there's some problematic behavior. They might be doing hiring and they might be doing firing. Depends how big the agency is, right? Sometimes they're not part of that because there's other particular people to do that, but they may be involved in hiring and firing. And the last thing we're going to talk about is compliance. Every agency has to go through audits, right? You need to make sure your stuff is in line. You can't just like be spending whatever you want. You got to go through compliance. I know that at a school we have once a month we are audited. Are our case notes in? Is our billing information correct? That type of thing. So the executive director should make sure that it is following all laws and regulations, because worst thing that would happen is you get sued because you're not doing that. And then there's a bunch of different nitty-gritty stuff, right? There's federal rules, there's IRS, there's taxes, so much stuff that the executive director needs to make sure the proper channels are paying attention to, because if you're not in compliance, that could mean you lose funding. That could mean that they're going to shut down your agency, right? If you're not compliant and it's egregious. So compliance is super, super, super important. Usually the bad things happen when it involves money, right? The oversight of the money is always where you want to be most compliant. You got to make sure your numbers line up. You got to make sure that the budget lines up. So you might need to follow local rules. You might need to follow federal rules, different filings for different things. Something that is way over my head. I would not know particularly what's going on with compliance, but the executive director has to have a pulse on that. And then of course, the organization should adhere to the highest ethical standards. What if you were the executive director of whatever nonprofit or agency you can think of in your head, what are some NASW code of ethics standards or principles that you would think would need to be always at the forefront of your mind? So you're the executive director, what ethical standards do you think? Obviously, all of them will apply, but which ones are coming to mind for you of which ethical standards would be really important? Safety, number one. Safety of clients, safety of employees. Rights of clients, confidentiality. Integrity. Dignity and worth of the person's coming to mind for me. Anything else? Self-determination. There's so many more legal and financial things that they need to respect. Service. Is this agency providing services that they need to? Is it eliminating barriers? Are they meeting the needs of clients? Are they meeting the needs of employees? So props to any of you if you are a CEO or executive director of an agency or a nonprofit, because it's a lot of responsibility. There's a lot to consider. And there's a lot riding on their shoulders. So it's a very important job and very important role to make things run well. Any questions about board members or executive directors or CEOs? Do you feel you have a good understanding of the difference? See people shaking their head. Yes, great. Okay. Like I said, this is very macro high level, but it all ties in, right? Like we have been in agencies or workplaces where there is an executive director or a CEO. So sometimes stuff that goes on behind the scenes, it still affects us, right? We generally get a paycheck from somewhere. So there's a lot that goes into the behind the scenes of running an agency or a nonprofit, and depending on the size as well. Okay. We are now going to jump into practice questions. We have 3 practice questions pertaining to board of directors, nonprofits, that type of thing. I'm going to read it. Like I always do for this, we will break it down together. There's only 3. Important that you are able to say why you chose the answer that you did. So if you're choosing answer D, tell me why are you choosing answer D. So be able to back up your reasoning. Okay, number 1. An employee witness, let me move my chat button here so I can see for you all. An employee witnesses a questionable pattern of behavior from the executive director at a social service nonprofit. The social worker believes that director has acted unethically and has engaged in problematic behavior. The employee is concerned that the behavior may be fraudulent. The behavior is not known to the board of directors. The employee should first discuss the matter with the director and then notify the chairman of the board. B, discuss the matter with the director and then notify the police. C, discuss the matter with colleagues and form a task group to investigate. D, obtain legal consult and present the findings. So you are the worker, you're an employee, you think some stuff's going on. Think of code of ethics, what it wants us to do when we have issues that arise with colleagues. What do we think here and why? I also hope you are never in this position. Let's hope that this is just a hypothetical and you never have to do this. What is your answer and why? So let's put important thing here, questionable pattern of behavior, right? We don't know exactly what's going on. The director might be acting unethically. It might be fraudulent. So not a lot of red flags here. What should we do first? So remember, first means you got to have a plan and then start your first step, and then you might do other things from there. So let's start to eliminate. Should we go to our colleagues, form a task group on our own and investigate? No, don't do that. That's going to get you in a lot of trouble, and it's not our role to form a group to investigate. That is not what we would do. So C is out. B is out. Why is B out? What's wrong with B? Notify the director and then notify the police. Are we there yet? Do we need to contact the police? No, we don't have enough information that it's, remember, when do we contact the police? Immediate danger to self or others. We don't have that information yet, right? We don't know how we would involve them. So now we are down to A, discuss the matter with the director and notify the chairman, or obtain legal consult and present the findings. First step is chain of command. A, discuss the matter with the director and then notify the chairman of the board, because we know that the board needs to be aware of what's going on, but chain of command, we need to say, I have found this, this, and this happening. I do feel uncomfortable with it. I don't think, what's going on is correct. We always have to give the person the chance to correct their behavior, or at least be notified of their inappropriate behavior, but the chairman of the board, chairman or chairwoman of the board, needs to be notified. Obtain legal consult and present the findings. The board may have you speak with someone from the legal team, but we don't go and just get legal consult on our own. That could be very sticky, right? Like if we're just like, I'm gonna go to get some legal consult, right? That wouldn't be the correct next step. You'd need a directive from someone a little bit higher up first. Any questions on that one? Okay. What's going to happen is the board will probably contact the lawyer, and the lawyer from there will know the next steps to do. Okay. An executive leadership team has discussed employee concerns at a recent board meeting. Many of the employees feel they do not have the proper skills to work with the target population. Training is lacking and the employees feel ineffective with little direction. What would be the first thing the leadership team should do to address these concerns? So go ahead, read this. We're not going to look at the answer choices yet. Just read this, pull out what you think is important. So executive leadership team, that's usually the people, like it could be a board, it could be like the high up people, the highest level people in the agency. Employees, they don't feel they have proper training. That's going to be a problem, right? If your employees feel they don't have the skills to work with the population, they feel ineffective and that there's little direction. What would be the first thing the leadership team should do? A, put together an agency-wide task force to address the concerns of the employees. B, examine the agent's mission statement to determine if it aligns with current agency policies and practice. C, contact an outside consultant to meet with the employees to collect feedback. D, offer the opportunity for staff to meet with HR to discuss their concerns further. First step. I'll show you the question again. Employees are feeling they don't have proper training. This one's tricky. And remember, this is what would you do first? We probably are going to do all of these things at a certain time, but there's got to be a starting point. So what are you choosing and why? Let's start eliminating. Are we to the point now that we need an outside consultant? We got to start from within first, right? You want to work the chain of command. So we're not going to go immediately to an outside consultant. There's a lot of things we can do inside first. Okay, so now we're to A, B, or D. Are we to the point yet where we have a task force, right? A task force usually would come once you collect more information. We are not to that point yet. This is a great idea, right? But not yet. So now we're down to B or D. Meeting with HR, would that really get to organizational change first? Right? No. So D is out first. They might need to meet with HR, but usually HR is more to discuss like personnel issues, benefits, those types of things. What the leadership team should do first is examine the agency's mission statement to determine if it aligns with agency policies and practices, because staff don't feel that they have the skills to work with the population and there's no training. So they need to say, what's our mission? What are our policies? What are our procedures? They might need to change onboarding. They might need to ramp up the employee training. So it's important to go further. Examine means get more information first, right? Like I said, we might put together a task force. They might need to speak with HR if things don't improve. And we might get an outside consultant, but you got to start first with internal examination of what's going on. Is there a breakdown? Are there barriers? Does our statement and our policy procedures even align with what we're trying to do as an agency? Does that make sense? That one was a tricky one. Remember, that was a first question. Okay. Our last one. Which of the following demonstrates an activity that should not be conducted by the board of directors? So this is an easy recall question. Which of the following should not? So you're looking for the one that board of directors should not do. A, garner financial support by hosting a silent auction for an agency. B, holding performance reviews of case managers and clinicians. C, engaging in the development of the agency's strategic plan. Or D, advocating for programs that are cost effective for the agency. What should the board of directors not be doing? There's 3 things they can do and one they might do, but they absolutely should not be doing it. Might they get financial support? Yes, right? Remember that sometimes is a big piece is getting those financial resources. Will they probably be engaged in the development of the strategic plan? Yes, that's definitely something that's involved in the board of directors. Should they advocate for programs that are cost effective? Yes, you don't want to waste money. They should not be like, if you have a board of directors holding one of your performance reviews, please bring this concern to someone. They would not even have the qualifications to be able to do performance reviews of case managers and clinicians because they're not directly contacting or, in day-to-day contact with the staff. They should not be directly supervising staff, so they should not be holding performance reviews. Okay. That was a lot of just kind of dry information. Macro board of directors and executive directors is not the most exciting work to discuss, right? It's a lot of policies and procedures and a lot of standards, but does anyone have any questions about anything that we covered about executive directors or nonprofits? So now the last thing I will leave you with, you started with your kind of pulse check of where you were feeling on some of this like macro nonprofit stuff. Now what would you rate your feeling of how you're feeling, your comfortability with more of this agency policies, procedures and macro stuff now that we are, we covered it a little bit more. A client should not be on a board, no. Because that'd be a conflict of interest. And this is something that if you're not in the macro space, you're not going to be an expert on it. And you don't need to be an expert on it for the test, but you need to have some knowledge of what goes on, right? That type of thing. So hope that you took some important points or at least got to think about some of the inner workings of what happens at agencies or nonprofits. Just like I said, poke around a little bit, like just do some Google searches, or if you work at an agency, like look up the board of directors. What do they do? What are their backgrounds? Or like I said, look up like if you live in Texas, look up your Texas social work, people that serve on that board. It's just interesting to see that what some of the requirements are, what some of the commitments are. Sometimes it's 2-year commitment, sometimes it's a 3-year commitment. It just really depends. Okay, like I said, I will send this recording out a little bit later today. And I will send an email about that. November study groups are coming. If you are testing before our next study group, good luck. You always know where to find me, agentsofchangeprep@gmail.com. I hope that you enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and thank you for joining us this afternoon or morning if you are on the West Coast. So thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your Sunday.